God is great. All right, Psalm 130, let's call this one redeemed or redemption because some form of both of those words is going to come up in this chapter. And those terms require, at least for me, a little bit of explanation, which will hopefully develop naturally from the passage as we begin in verse 1. Not so much reading the passage, because for me, this one was a little bit confusing, more confusing than usual, and it began to become clear after I think I started to see some themes, because this is another prayer in which the psalmist is going to ask God to basically help get him out of a bind. That's that concept of redemption, a term that really describes being freed from lockup, something that you were stuck in or locked in that you were struggling to break free of. Essentially describes the way in which somebody cuts the chains and sets you free. And that is, in a lot of ways, what this psalmist is asking for in the psalm, where he begins in verse 1 talking about the way in which he cries to God. He's going to shift in verse 5 to talk about the way in which he waits for God and hopes in God, as he goes into the last two verses of the chapter 7 and 8, saying, because I have done this, I'm going to practice what I preach and counsel Israel to likewise hope in God. And the why is going to seem to start around verse 3, where he is going to talk about, if God should mark iniquities, who could stand? But, and that's going to give the reason for why he hopes in God. Verse 4, but with you there is forgiveness, that you may be feared. And beyond forgiveness in verse 7, when he starts to open it up to all Israel based upon the freedom from all of the guilt and the shame that he experienced, he's going to say, likewise, Israel can experience not only the freedom from the guilt and shame, but redemption from something else. In verse 7, as he is going to say, for with God there is steadfast love, and with him there is plentiful redemption, as he's going to conclude in verse 8, and he will redeem Israel from all his iniquities. And when I first read that, maybe the first few times I looked at it, I superimposed my understanding of what he meant in terms of redemption onto what it's actually saying. And it wasn't clear to me until I remembered something I heard from a teacher, Zach Poonen. I don't agree with everything he says, but he seemed to really encapsulate the difference between what I was seeing in the passage from what it's actually saying. He said, as believers, sometimes we want to be forgiven, but not saved. See, because saved is more along the lines of what we see here in the concept of redemption. He's saying, in so far as God is willing to redeem Israel from its iniquities, he is setting us free from the need to walk in patterns that we once considered shameful. See, I'm happy to have God remove my shame for doing a certain thing, but I'm more reluctant to actually walk out of that habit. Reminding me again of something Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, specifically the Beatitudes, when he said, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Beyond giving us the ability to hold our heads up in public, those who actually desire or hunger and thirst for a level of character that's consistent with being able to hold ourselves up in, quote unquote, good company. And the reason why any of that seemed to matter to me at all is the degree to which, beyond the doubts about whether or not God exists, is there's another hurdle that we have to cross, and that is desiring to actually have God heal us on his terms. Meaning there are times when I want God to forgive me as long as I can clutch or cling on to my narrative. And sometimes that narrative is, I never really did anything wrong in the first place. And if I never did anything wrong, the truth is I don't really need forgiveness. But what we really want is forgiveness without having to actually confess and admit to the things that we have done. And the danger in that is sometimes we want permission to continue doing those things and to still be forgiven. When what Zach Poonen is trying to help us to understand is really similar to what the psalmist is helping us to understand, is that God gets to set the terms of redemption. And for him, redemption means, or at least seems to mean, beyond being forgiven our wrongs, moving into a place where we genuinely hunger and thirst to be freed from repeating them.